So round 7, I'm on 2.5 out of 6, and I would say the tournament is going not stellar so far, like -1. But I was one of the lower rated players in the field, so I felt like it wasn't so bad. But in this round, I'm paired against the second of 3 grandmasters and the top seed, I would say by far in the event, Grandmaster Jinchao Zhu. Really strong player, originally from China, but he plays in a lot of US events, so I've seen him at like tons of open events and stuff. And yeah, very strong player, generally over like 2600 FIDE, and usually like crushing everything. But I was very much looking forward to this game because it's always a pleasure to play against like a really strong player. Especially if you can bring your A game, you know, the way they outplay you is always kind of interesting. And I think this game was pretty instructive overall. So, okay, I started off with my usual d4. He went d5, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and here he played c6. Black, of course, has like many different options here, but he goes for the semi-Slav. And I don't think this was too much of a surprise for me. So I went with e3. This is what I usually play here. Knight d7. And now bishop e2. So this one is kind of a newer line for me. Usually I would play like queen c2 in this position. Bishop d3 is, of course, one of the big main lines here. But lately I've been playing this one. And the idea of putting the bishop here is just so that when black takes on c4, it doesn't hit this bishop on d3. And this gives white an extra option to play a4. And then the idea is to pick up the pawn with knight d2, knight takes c4. And yeah, this actually can be kind of annoying for black, because it's not so easy for black to get c5 or e5 in so comfortably. So I feel like white can definitely fight for kind of a small edge in these lines. So what black often does against this one, and what happens in this game, is black just doesn't really take on c4, just goes bishop d6, castles, and this gives white a chance to play b3. And now I can just recapture on c4 with the pawn, so this isn't really such a great option for black anymore. The bishop comes to b2, and yeah, we get one of these positions that's like, I think, pretty dry overall. Where both sides kind of develop normally. Black often plays for c5 in this kind of position, and then we get kind of like a variety of structures. A lot of times white will take on d5 here, and black will often recapture with the pawn, and you get a situation where white is trying to leave black either with hanging pawns or with an isolated queen pawn. So a lot of nuance in these positions, and I believe the main move here is queen c2, which is very logical, just planning to like bring the rooks into the center. Sometimes white even spends an extra tempo on bishop d3, and then often will play for e4. Or the bishop can drop back to f1, and then one day even go like g3, bishop g2, and kind of reposition on this diagonal. So it's a very slow game. White is playing for a really small advantage. But I've had a pretty good time in these kinds of positions. I feel like, I don't know exactly what my score is, but generally I do quite well. Not in this game though. In this game, my opponent definitely outplays me quite seriously. So I decide to play bishop d3 in this position. And this is also a known line. The idea is, again, I'm just going to play rook e1, maybe queen c2, rook d1, and eventually play for e4. And here black just immediately played c5, which is not necessary. Black can also just kind of slowly build up as well. In fact, a lot of players will just play queen e7, rook d8, rook e8, and just kind of wait. But here he decides to play c5 immediately. The drawback to this one is white gets to take on d5. Now black takes with the pawn. If they take with the piece, I think it doesn't really help their cause, because white will trade on d5. And now if black takes with the pawn, bishop on b7 is not really great, and eventually white will take, and black will have some possibly weak pawns in the center. And then if they keep taking with pieces, like taking with the bishop here, then white can often play like e4, and then sometimes even e5, or taking on c5 or queen e2. And this isn't always that much for white, but sometimes it can lead to kind of a fairly annoying initiative. So black just takes back with the pawn, and now we get the structure that generally I'm quite fond of, because I like that the tension here favors white. And what I mean by that is if black takes on d4, then white is always recapturing with a piece and then leaving black with an isolated queen pawn. So it's rarely good for black to be able to take on d4 here, whereas white can actually consider taking on c5 almost every move and leaving black either with hanging pawns or with an isolated pawn, up to black to decide how they want to recapture. So I really have always kind of liked that, the fact that I have this like flexibility just to take whenever I want, whereas for black it's really rare that they actually want to take on d4, because then they're just left with this weak pawn on d5. Okay, so now there are different options here. I end up playing queen e2, and here is where I guess like my lack of opening knowledge in this kind of structure really shows itself, because I feel like I have maybe a general understanding about the structure and how to play it, but without really knowing the details and the specifics. And it's maybe one of the areas where you really see some distance between me and grandmasters and stronger players and stuff, because I feel like these guys they know these positions pretty deep. So the problem with queen e2, it looks like a very natural move, and here I'm actually just playing for a very thematic idea to go bishop a6, trading off the light squared bishop, which is kind of one of black's like most important defenders of the d5 pawn. And in general, in these positions, I think we talked about this earlier in an earlier round when I was playing like against the isolated queen pawn. In general, like trading minor pieces is quite nice, because the fewer minor pieces that are on the board, the weaker the pawns kind of feel, and the more relevant their weaknesses to the position. So very natural plan. And in fact, if black just continues like normally, like rook e8, let's say, and allows white to play bishop a6, I would think that white is actually starting to achieve something here. We got rook d1 coming, and then eventually dc5, and this d5 pawn is always kind of tender without the light square bishop on the board. But black just plays a6, and like during the game, at least, I definitely didn't really understand the strength of this move immediately, because at first glance it does kind of look odd that black is just putting a pawn under attack. Like now the rook has to stay on a8 to defend this pawn. He can't even play like rook c8, which would be a very natural way to develop the rook. So it was like very strange for me, but actually the move ends up making a ton of sense. And it's not even about playing b5 here, because I'm able, like I can play a4 right now if I wanted to and stop b5. But rather that just like the queen and the bishop aren't super effective on this diagonal. And eventually white just kind of runs out of moves. So I think, I'm not sure if white really can fight for any kind of serious edge here. But there are different plans white can try. Generally, like this move bishop f5 at some point is considered, I think, to be kind of a good idea in these positions. White can maybe start with rook c1 first and then play bishop f5. But the idea behind this one would be to kind of plant the bishop on this diagonal, where it can definitely exert more pressure than it does on d3, kind of biting against this g6 pawn. And it always gives white the option to pull the bishop back to g2, which is an idea that comes up quite often in these positions. And then the bishop on g2, I would say, is pretty well placed. So I don't think black has to play g6 here. I think that's kind of helping white, if anything. But I would say this is probably a more standard way of maybe fighting for at least some pressure. Because after queen e2, a6, I go rook c1, rook e8, rook fd1, and g6. And this move is in general just kind of useful for black. Okay, it stops bishop f5, and then if black plays an eventual knight e4, then they can kind of support this one with f5 as well. And yeah, at this moment, I'm like kind of running out of moves to play. Like black isn't really going to go rook c8 anytime soon, but black still has moves like queen e7, for example, and h5 even. And yeah, now white needs to find a plan, and it's really not obvious what to do. If I take, black just recaptures with the pawn, and don't really have any kind of immediate pressure here. And of course, I always have to watch out for d4, especially with black's rook lined up against the queen. So I end up playing queen f1, just getting the queen out of the way of the rook. I think it's one of the more reasonable moves in the position. I was thinking h3 was also probably pretty playable. But yeah, the bigger issue is that I just couldn't find a good plan here. And now black plays queen e7, and here I played bishop b1, and this is probably where I start to go wrong. I would say this is maybe my first inaccuracy of the game. I think if I go h3 here, everything is still more or less fine. And it's really not that easy for black either. Like, for example, if black plays like knight e4 here, which looks natural, then white does take on c5. And let's say black takes with the pawn, white would take on e4 with the bishop, forcing d takes e4, and then after knight d2, white's knights have some very nice squares on the queen side to jump on, like knight c4, knight to d5. The bishop on this diagonal is beautiful and will probably need to be traded off. But here I would think white has a very serious strategic advantage. Just for example, just to show that it's actually not so simple for black to play this position either. But I think the point is that I needed to just keep this one on the diagonal to keep black from being able to deploy the rook with rook to c8. Because after bishop b1, now black plays rook c8 because I've allowed him. And now the pawn's not hanging, right? If I play bishop d3 back, well then okay, then black will just play b5 and I'm losing a ton of time. dc, knight takes c5, and I'm not really wanting to give up my bishop here, so I might have to spend another tempo moving the bishop, and then black gets b4 in and a5, and just has a very active version of the IQP. So this one isn't really suitable for me anymore. And so yeah, instead of dropping the bishop back, I think h3 would have been better. Maybe even like knight e2, knight f4, like transferring the knight over this way, I think would also be quite a reasonable plan. But okay, I play here, rook c8. Now I played a4 because I realized black wants to go b5 and c4. Black, and now it goes h6. And I remember during the game I was very surprised by this move, just because I couldn't really understand what the idea was. I mean, it seems just like some kind of neutral improving move, but I really didn't understand why this move and why not h5 or some other move. But it ends up working out because in response I play a pretty bad move. I play knight e2 in this position. Probably think I can do, again, something like h3 and white is fine. I think black is equal, but I don't think white is really worse yet. But I end up playing knight e2 because I'm just trying to do something, so I'm looking to improve the knight. But this one allows c4, and that's actually a big problem because now black is taking over the queen side. Black has this idea to play bishop a3 and get rid of like an important defender of my queen side. And yeah, if I take on c4, then after dc, the problem is black is getting b5 in, and black's queenside pawns are very strong. So this is like a typical transformation. It's not always good for black, it's not always good for white, it really depends. But the key thing to figure out is whether white can actually get e4 and d5 in. And if white can get the central pawns moving, then white's position is often very nice because these pawns are very strong. But here I can't because the squares are all under control and all blockaded. And if I play knight c3 back, which I think is the most logical move, stopping b5 and trying to push e4 and d5 and so on, well, black has time for bishop b4. And I realized during the game that this is actually just not going to work. And black is ready to just take on c3 and just put pieces on the light squares and just totally dominate the pawns. And yeah, white is probably, maybe even just strategically lost. And if e4, I think black just takes and can just like snag this pawn. And we'll have enough enough pieces to defend and get out of any kind of pins. Maybe knight takes c4 is also good here. So this move knight e2 is a serious mistake just because it allows black to play c4. In this position here, c4 is not really a threat. If I just play like h3 and black goes c4, then we take, black takes with the pawn. We're in time to, I don't know if we can play e4 right now, but we can start with knight d2, and we have e4, we have this pawn under attack, and b5 is not possible right now for black. So this would be a version that's just very, very good for white, because now the pawns are starting to move, and things are going. But of course, on h3, I don't think black would play c4 here. And I should say, if c4 takes, rook takes c4, it's just not such a great structure for black, because they're left with this isolated pawn on d5. I mean, it's not an open file, but it's still quite a weak pawn, and white is going to have ways of putting pressure on it. So I don't think this would be so good for black. But if I played h3, I'm not exactly sure how my opponent would continue, but I think he just keeps building up somehow. Maybe like king h7, maybe like rook c7 or something, or maybe bishop b8, also very, very typical move, just kind of pulling the bishop out of the way, and yeah, game would continue. Knight e4 for black is often possible, but the drawback to this one, I mentioned this in a different variation, is that white can take on c5 often, and then you have multiple problems. Number one, the d5 pawn sometimes hangs, but even without this one, I would say this structure is often quite nice for white, where you have like knight c4 and knight d5 coming, and black's pawns are all kind of split and isolated. So yeah, black is just kind of left with a lot of weaknesses, and light squared bishop isn't so active here. So yeah, it would definitely be, I think, still a very, very fighting game. Now after this one, c4, black is already, I would say, taking over, and I'm not even sure what's best for white at this point, because like b5 is just coming, and the pawns are just rolling. b4, c3, bishop a3 somewhere, and it's really, really bad. I mean, white is essentially just having no space. I decided to try knight c3 back, which essentially is a pawn sacrifice. Black takes on b3. But now I played bishop d3. And I guess I was just trying to get back into the game. So my idea with this one is, all right, I'm hitting the a6 pawn once again. But what I really want to do is play knight d2 and, of course, win my pawn back. But if like rook a8, for example, then knight d2, then I think I'm getting this one back, and things are definitely not so bad. Like black can go bishop a3, but then rook b1, and it's very important that we got the rook off of the c file, because otherwise black would take and the knight would hang. But here, I think we're in time to just pick the pawn back up. Unfortunately for me, black plays bishop a3 here, and so this one is hanging, so I don't have time to take on a6. And if I take on a3 first and then take on a6, then black is just playing b2, maybe let's say trading first and then pushing b2, and it seems like I'm just losing on the spot. So on bishop a3, I end up going queen e2, just trying to keep control. Now knight e4 is played. I played knight e5. And yeah, here I'm just basically trying to turn the game around, because I'm down a pawn pretty much for nothing. But if I'm able to win back the pawn, then things would be okay. So knight e5, I'm trying to just kind of cause chaos in the position. Now, of course, black does take on e5. I don't think he had to, but it is logical. And this one is hanging on a3, so he can't take back right away, but he takes on b2. And now queen takes b2. And so my idea was, if black is going queen takes e5, well then I'm going to take this one, d takes c4, I get this one back. I'm still down a pawn, but looking at the position, to me this felt like not the healthiest extra pawn for black, right? It's like hanging on b6, and I have some pressure here. The bishop on b7 is kind of passive. I can maneuver my knight to e2 and d4. I thought, okay, maybe I have some saving chances here. And yeah, in reality, I think it's not that bad for white just yet. But okay, of course, he doesn't take this one. He goes knight c5 instead, which is a lot stronger, defending the pawn, also maybe hitting the bishop. I played f4. And yeah, at this point, actually, we reached kind of an interesting moment because, I mean, I'm still down a pawn, but somehow I felt like my position at least has like prospects. Like I was thinking about maneuvering the bishop from e2 to f3, maybe knight e2, knight to d4. It's not so easy for black to do something on the queen side, because if black ever takes the pawn, I have queen takes b3. And yeah, maybe one day I can hope to maybe achieve something on the king side. So here, I remember he started spending a lot of time, and he ends up going g5, which really felt like black was lashing out, because he's kind of opening up his own king. And yeah, my first thought here was actually to play bishop f5, because this looked very logical, just gaining a tempo on the rook, also hitting the d5 pawn. I figured black would probably play rook to d8, and then I had rook d4 in mind. Basically to keep black from being able to push d4 and opening up the bishop, because otherwise black can like take on f4, push d4, the bishop opens up, and it's very, very dangerous. So yeah, I wanted to do something like this. Honestly, I started to feel like white's chances are kind of nice here. I have like rook cd1 coming, I can put pressure on the d5 pawn, and I mean if black's king starts to open up, you know, I can play for some kind of attack. Then I started considering other options, and I noticed this move bishop e2 also kind of interesting, because instead of putting the bishop on f5, maybe I can put it on f3 and just go after the d5 pawn immediately. And then I got very attracted to this, and actually I spent a lot of time, because I honestly couldn't decide like which move I liked more. I honestly liked both of them, and they both looked good, and I was like, I don't know which one to play. Like bishop f5 more active, and like kind of with tempo, rook to d4, or bishop e2 probably stronger, or possibly stronger, because I put the bishop on f3 and the pawn on d5 is under attack. So I ended up playing bishop e2. This was actually a really tough choice for me, and I remember not knowing how to choose and almost choosing at random, just like I really didn't know. But okay, time is ticking, and you know I can't just think forever. I have to choose something. Ultimately, I went with this one because on bishop f5 and rook d8, rook d4, I noticed that black can maybe play f6 in this position. And then I wasn't actually really sure how to react to this one. Intuitively, I didn't think it was like great for black, but I couldn't find a move for white, because e5 is hanging, e3 is hanging. You know, if I lose these pawns, everything starts to collapse. Because this knight on c5, pawn on b3 is like very, very sturdy on the queen side. So the only reason I'm not just like dead lost in the position is because I have some kind of grip on the king side in the center. But after f6, it all starts to kind of crumble. So yeah, eventually I ended up going with bishop e2, but I think this was still the wrong choice, because this gives black time to just take immediately ef4, and then he hits me with d4. And then once I saw this on the board, I realized, oh man, I just like completely blew it. Now, the truth is, bishop f5 was the best move. But after rook to d8, I was right. Rook d4 f6 was a serious problem. And yeah, Stockfish I don't think finds a solution here for white, and white is more or less just busted. But the stronger move here would have been to play knight to e2, which I didn't really consider at this moment in the game, or in this line. But the point being to just bring the knight to d4, and again try to kind of keep some grip over the king side. I mean, it still gets messy. Like after f6, for example, I think the engine suggests I go e6, and if knight takes e6, we trade, we go rook c3, and it's not a super clear position. I mean, like I would think black probably just pitches the pawn, like goes d4 and something like takes, queen e4. And I would say both sides have a weakened king. Honestly, I'm not even sure. I mean, I don't know. My gut feeling would be that black has kind of the better practical chances here, just because I feel like now that the bishop is opened up, this is just such a strong piece. The engine was saying it's like about equal, but I mean, it's obviously a incredibly messy position, and I don't know, from a human point of view, I feel like black's position feels somewhat easier to play. But yeah, that would have been, I mean, the best chance. And okay, a nice chance given that, you know, a couple moves ago, I think I was more or less busted, and all of a sudden, you know, to get it to a position that's like kind of unclear and messy, I think it's kind of, would be, you know, an achievement. But in the game, unfortunately, it really just goes downhill very, very quickly after bishop e2. Black takes, hits me with d4. Every move actually was like surprising here. Rook takes d4, he goes knight e6. Okay, this one I expected. Rook to d3. And at this point I was, you know, calculating like, okay, he's going to take knight takes f4. Maybe I'll go rook to g3 check. I was hopeful, you know, maybe I can get something going against black's king here. Then he actually plays queen to c5 check, and I realized, oh my god, it's actually way worse than I thought. Like, okay, it feels like maybe I'm losing a pawn or something, but actually it's very, very bad after queen c5, because I'm forced to play king h1, or on king f1 it would be no different. And now black has bishop takes g2 all of a sudden. King takes g2, knight takes f4 comes with check. I tuck my king away back in the corner, knight takes d3, bishop takes d3, rook takes c5, and okay, the smoke is cleared now, and black has a rook and a couple pawns for 2 pieces, but yeah, more importantly, my king is super weak, black's pieces are super active, this pin is difficult to deal with, and yeah, essentially black is just completely winning here. Even like, if I somehow managed to escape into an endgame, it would still be really bad. Black would have like rook and 2 pawns against the 2 pieces, and yeah, really not a lot of upside for white. But even before the endgame, right now the immediate problem is that black wants to go like rook g5 and like queen c6 check, and yeah, it's very, very difficult here for white. Also, I think rook e3 is just an immediate threat, like on queen takes b3. I think rook e3 possibly, and yeah, essentially things are really bad. Or actually, I think just immediate queen c6 check was the problem, because bishop e4, there's rook takes c4, and if king g1, rook g5 check, my king is just getting immediately mated. So yeah, we reached this position, and okay, I realized I'm completely lost. I played h4. Just defend the g5 square. I really didn't see what else to do. I think everything just more or less loses on the spot. And black played queen d4. And here I thought for a little bit, but eventually ended up resigning. I mean, I think I'm down to like 2 minutes at this point anyway. But yeah, now it's really just hopeless, as everything is hanging in my position. So yeah, it was kind of surprising, but after bishop e2, I mean, this was basically like just a losing move. Like, this all happened pretty much by force. Like knight e6, check, takes, and we end up here. I was not expecting that when I played this move, bishop e2. But yeah, tough game. I definitely made a lot of mistakes and inaccuracies, and I think it's one of those things where, you know, when you play against, let's say, a lower rated player, they often don't punish you for these little inaccuracies, but players of this level, they definitely do. So yeah, I think the main mistake, a couple things. So yeah, this queen e2 surprisingly turned out to be a little bit inaccurate, kind of ineffective. And then bringing the bishop back, allowing black to play rook ac8. And then knight e2, I think maybe the biggest mistake of the game, allowing black to push c4 and just create huge counterplay on the queen side. But yeah, tough game, but you know, what are you gonna do? Definitely an interesting one, and really kind of helped my understanding of the structure.